Welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Weaver and I'm joined today by Paul Robichaux. Before we get started, I would like to review a few pieces of housekeeping. At this time, all lines are currently muted and will remain muted for the session today. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them to us using the questions feature on the right-hand toolbar. We will attempt to answer all the questions during the session. This session is being recorded and a link will be shared to all registered attendees in a few days. So thanks for joining today. It seems this is an exciting topic for us. It seems every day we get up and we see all these headlines on the news like this. And even overnight, we saw Disney announce that they are purchasing 21st Century Fox, which is another very large acquisition. And 2017 certainly seems to be the year of very large acquisitions. As a IT professional that specializes in mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, this is really a interesting topic for us, and we're excited to bring it to you here. I know when I handled these very large acquisitions, it was always a very interesting scenario to wake up in the morning and see that big news flash on your screen that your organization was part of a very large acquisition. As we look at our traditional ways of doing these integrations and divestitures, our traditional tools that we used when we had on-premises systems are going away. And a lot of times we've been able to avoid this where one organization was on-premises systems and the other organizations are on Office 365. Now, a lot of the projects that we're seeing are true Office 365 cloud-to-cloud integrations. And so the game has really changed, and what we're hoping to cover in this series is really focusing on what's changed in the merger, acquisition, and divestiture space. And today, Paul and I are hoping to go into various aspects of that, and not just the technology, but a lot of the new organizational factors that affect us as well. So with that, to just introduce everyone here, it's with great pleasure that I introduce Paul Robichaux. Paul is a Chief Technology Officer here at Quadrotech. Paul's a 15-time Microsoft Office Systems and Servers MVP, and at Quadrotech, he's responsible for product evangelism, communications, and along with various other projects that we'll learn about here in 2018. So Paul, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Mike. You know, we're not planning on buying Disney in 2018. I feel like I ought to get that out in the open right from the start.
I'm glad we can get that set straight right at the beginning.
Don't want to start any rumors.
Exactly. And to formalize my introduction here, my name is Mike Weaver. I'm the Director of Enterprise Migrations here at Quadrotech. I joined Quadrotech from industry where I specialized in mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. And here at Quadrotech, I am a product owner of some of our products that do merger, acquisition, and divestiture work. So with that, Paul, I'm going to kind of head it over to you to go over today's agenda.
Okay, great. Thank you. So today what we're going to be talking about is primarily some of the security implications around mergers and acquisitions as they relate to Office 365. There's a lot that can be said, really more than we have time for in one webcast. So what we've decided to do is break the topic up into three pieces. So today we're going to talk about M&A, about the business dynamics behind M&A, what those dynamics mean from an IT perspective, and what you need to be thinking about or be prepared to do in Office 365 to make a merger or acquisition go smoothly, even if the 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 pieces of different companies that are coming together are in different geographies and different places around the world on different source systems. We're going to address that by talking about some of the business problems that are inherent in M&A, and then go through we kind of jokingly call it 5 steps to heaven, but a 5-step process that covers the planning and implementation of your migration and unification. In part 2, we're going to talk about the same kinds of things, but from a divestiture standpoint. So for example, when a company decides to shed a business unit or sells part of it to a competitor, as is happening with the Fox conglomerate, they're selling off the 21st Century Fox portion, but many other parts of the Fox media empire are still sticking around. So they're doing the opposite of what we're going to be talking about today in some ways. And then part 3, we're going to focus more on some specific security concerns and talk about how to remediate those. It's really important to remember when you start thinking about M&A that it's a broad term. There are a lot of different types of M&A scenario that you may run into in the business world, because some are much more like a partnership or a merger of equals or a joint venture, whereas others are one company acquiring and driving behavior at another. So as an example of this latter type, we can look at Amazon and Whole Foods. Amazon is a much, much, much larger company by revenue, by headcount, and by geography than Whole Foods is. So when Amazon bought Whole Foods, that was a straight up acquisition. And as a result, almost immediately, Amazon came out and said, hey, Whole Foods, we know you run a lot of your business systems on Azure. That's stopping. You're going to run everything on AWS. They started putting Amazon package lockers in Whole Foods stores. They made a bunch of other business integrations on the back end that were dictated by what Amazon wanted and not necessarily what Whole Foods would have proposed on their own. On the other side, we have Disney versus Pixar. So Disney was very careful when they acquired Pixar to leave Pixar alone for the most part. Slowly over time, you could do a fascinating case study about Disney's IT processes because they are very, very, very good. Disney has got a really tightly run, tightly managed IT shop, and they do an excellent job of running their operations. And in part, that's because they're very methodical about making decisions when they do things like acquire another company. So they left Pixar alone. Pixar has a lot of specialized hardware and resources that they use for renders and whatnot. And Disney said, you guys keep doing what you're doing. You keep making money. Just the checks are going to Disney now instead of Pixar. And slowly over time, they have assimilated more of Pixar's IT operations. Then sort of a mid-example is Microsoft. Microsoft has such an extensive history of M&As over the last 30 years or so that you can find examples of both of these types. For example, when they bought Skype several years ago, they mostly left Skype alone. And gradually over time, they've been integrating consumer Skype with the rest of their platforms for billing, but they've also done integration the other way where they've used the Skype telephony network as a way to terminate calls made from Skype for Business Online and from Teams Online. So for our purposes, when Mike and I go through our content today, we're going to assume that there are two companies, A and B, and that what they want is they want to have a single merged environment. Now, there are a couple different ways that they can arrive at this. One is that B can move into A's tenant. One is that A can move into B's tenant. And one is that A and B can both move into a new tenant, which we'll refer to as C. I realize that's a little confusing, but it's easier than trying to use Microsoft fake company names or other things like that to talk about the players in these scenarios. Okay, next slide, please. When you think about an M&A, this is really sort of the culmination of a long process when one company decides to merge with or buy another. And there are some business problems that result almost invariably when you see the process get to the point of actually signing the papers. So the first thing to keep in mind is that most of the time when these deals are done, they are done by the business leaders of the companies, perhaps with outside assistance from an investment bank or something like that. IT folks are often not involved until after the deal is done and the two organizations are legally merged. Depending on the industry, sometimes there are restrictions on when the IT folks can start to talk to each other. But it is not at all uncommon for the CIO of one company to be told by his boss, you're going to go meet with the CIO of this company we just bought, and the two of you are going to hammer out a plan to merge our operations. You don't always get a head start. Sort of related to that, we have what we call the marriage problem. Anybody who's ever gotten married, especially as an adult, understands this problem. I guess when I say adult, especially somebody who's been living on their own for a while and has accumulated some household stuff. When two people get married, if they each have a toaster, do you really need two toasters in the merged household? Do you need two snowblowers or two lawnmowers? So there's always this process of negotiation when couples with stuff get married. They have to decide whose stuff are they keeping. The same thing's true for these companies. So if you think about A and B wanting to merge, they have to decide which Office 365 tenant they're going to keep. And remember, A could move into B, B could move into A, or together they could move into a completely new tenant. Which Active Directory structure and system are they going to keep? Where is DirSync going to be run from, etc. And this gets especially interesting and especially complicated if A and B are in different regions or geographies. It's relatively simple if they're both in the EU, if they're both in North America, if they're both in the same country, that's not a huge deal. The reason I say EU is because EU essentially has uniform data governance and privacy and data sovereignty requirements and restrictions. Where things really get interesting is when, say, a Swiss pharmaceutical company buys a US pharmaceutical company. Now, all of a sudden, that US company has a whole bunch of new IT regulatory and compliance obligations that they did not have operating in the US only. Next slide, please. You have to spend some time thinking about wants versus needs in migration. And the reason I say that is what everybody sort of imagines a migration will be like is that every data item on both sides will be brought together and unified with correct permissions and good auditing, and everybody will know what data there is, and that process will go smoothly and quickly and cheaply. In the real world, that's actually not always what happens. So the first problem is A and B probably have all sorts of data that they don't even know about. Public folders are probably the most classic example of this. It's very rare for me to meet with a customer who has a good handle on what is actually in their public folder database. If I'm lucky, they know about how much data they have and they know how many folders they have. But in many cases, they have no way to go back and say, oh, well, out of the 52 terabytes of public folder data that we have, it turns out that 17 terabytes of that stuff is just garbage and we can throw it away. It would be great if people knew that from the get-go, but they often don't. We have the problem of policy and application mapping. And these are related, so I'll discuss them together. But different companies will have different business processes, and those will often lead to different IT security requirements. Company A may have a requirement that you can only use mobile devices through a management system such as Microsoft Intune or AirWatch, whereas Company B doesn't. So, okay, now you have a problem because you have a mismatch in policies between these two places, and because there is technical implementation that underlies those policies. So on one side, you have Intune, you have some Intune policy objects, you have devices enrolled, which means you have a device enrollment mechanism. None of that stuff exists on the B side. So if you want to move A into B, now all of a sudden you have to snap your fingers and magic that stuff up out of nowhere. You also have the business problem, because this is not really a technical issue, of who's going to own defining and enforcing those policies. And a lot of times this just settles down to, if Company A is buying Company B, then the Company A IT team, they're sort of the winner and they get to be the boss. But that's certainly not always the case. For application mapping, we have the same problem, just at a different level. If one company is using SAP and one company is using Workday, for example, well, you probably only want to pick one. We see this all the time with people who are using CRM systems. Because although Salesforce is a market leader, not everybody uses Salesforce. So if a company that has Microsoft CRM buys a company that's using Salesforce, at some point they're going to have to make a decision about which horse to ride. Next slide, please, Mike. License reconciliation. I don't even like saying those words. But the issue here is that most sizable companies are going to have a Microsoft Enterprise Agreement. And that enterprise agreement dictates what licenses you have and how much you pay for them. So one of the very most common and very thorniest issues that you face during an M&A is deciding, okay, how do you spend the least amount of money possible on the licenses that you need to run your business? Maybe that's growing one EA and shrinking the other. Maybe it's going to Microsoft and saying, hey, we want a new deal because now we have twice as many seats under the same organization, etc. In order to do that, you have to have really good knowledge and visibility into what licenses you have, how much you're paying for them, and what licenses you need, which is really a reporting issue. In that same vein, understanding whether the right people have the right permissions on the right data items is super critical in the merged organization. Some organizations will already have that data because they're using something like radar reporting for security and audit. Other organizations may not have that data. Again, reporting on what's going on is a technical issue But understanding that you need to know that and making decisions about who should be able to access what is purely a business issue. And then finally, data sovereignty. We could easily do a whole week worth of webcasts just covering this one topic, because between different jurisdictions, there are all sorts of different requirements about where your data may be stored, who can see it, what you're allowed to retain, and so on. I'll give you just one example. In Turkey, in Russia, and in Israel, you essentially, and I'm simplifying a little bit, are not allowed to store your business data outside the country if you have a business operation in that country. So that means if you're buying a company that has a Russian operation or Russian subsidiary, you have to think, okay, well, for Office 365, if I'm using that, what does that mean? I can't guarantee that all my data stays in Russia. There's no Office 365 data center in Russia right now. Really complicated set of problems to try to solve, and they're business problems for the most part. Okay, Mike, next slide, please. Now, from a technology standpoint, we have the technology that underlies all the business problems we already talked about. Plus, we have some new ones that are purely technical in nature. The first being that hybrid is an ongoing process. Microsoft likes to portray hybrid as being something where you just sort of plug two cables together, and then your hybrid organization is up and going, and DirSync works, and ADFS, if you use it, works, and it's all just magic. The fact is, it is pretty magic when it works properly, but it's not a short-term process, because most organizations, especially during an M&A, are going to find that it takes them longer than they would like to combine the organizations. And that's especially true if you imagine that organization A has mailboxes on-prem, organization B has mailboxes on-prem, and together they want to move to a new Office 365 tenant. That's a completely separate problem. But even if the two organizations are both already on Office 365, there are a whole bunch of other hybrid and interrelationship questions that come into play. Identity management is a good example. Whose Active Directory is the source? Are you going to use a federation tool such as ADFS or Ping? Are you going to take this opportunity to get off identity federation tools and move to something like pass-through authentication, which is what Microsoft is now recommending? Are you going to make policy changes? And if so, how are you going to enforce them around identity management? Security incident and event management, or SIEM. From a technical standpoint, this is really important, because as soon as you connect those two networks and start sharing resources between them, you just multiplied the attack surface for both companies, because now there are more entry points into the network and there's more valuable data. Remember that during the Home Depot breach, Home Depot got penetrated because a third-party HVAC contractor that had credentials to get into Home Depot's network was penetrated. So when you have two organizations that are combining, being able to track what happens from a security standpoint is super important. SMTP mail flow, nice thing is that's a well-understood problem. Microsoft has been working on solving that for quite a long time, and for the most part, we understand what the issues are there in terms of allowing A.com and B.com to exchange mail back and forth, so that internal mail is not marked as spam, but external mail and outbound mail are being properly filtered, and so on. Now, these last two are probably the most interesting categories of problems. First is data classification, labeling, and triage. The reason I mentioned Swedish death cleaning, it's not actually a metal band, although that's what I thought when I first heard the term, but it's sort of a social tradition in many of the Scandinavian countries that when people get into their 50s or 60s, they voluntarily start decluttering their lives, throwing away old magazines, and cleaning out stuff they don't want, giving things to their kids or to other family members, with the intent that when they finally do pass away, whatever that is, their families will not have to go through 75, 80 years of accumulated stuff. I actually kind of like that idea. And it's definitely applicable here, because if you think about a typical company, they will have all sorts of data on file shares, on possibly a OneDrive, certainly in backup tapes. What do you do with all that? Do you have to keep it all? Well, the ideal thing would be that you would already have everything labeled and classified so that you would know which data items are subject to which retention policies. But as a practical matter, if you haven't already done that, nobody in the world is going to want to sit down and do that work as part of an M&A scenario. So then you have to decide, okay, is it important enough to do it to force that it be done? And if so, who's going to do it? Where is it going to be done? What tools am I going to use for it? Then systems integration, really any kind of M&A is one big exercise in systems integration, because the problem that you face there is that company A and company B may have completely different systems for the things I've listed here, fax being a huge one. If, for example, you think of a large healthcare company such as CVS that does pharmacy management, they send and receive literally millions of faxes a month. So if CVS is able to pull off a merger with Aetna, or I guess really it's the other way around, maybe that's not so bad because they both have pretty extensive fax infrastructures. But when CVS bought Caremark, they really had a lot of challenges to deal with, just in terms of that one little tiny, what seems like a tiny piece of the overall process, right? I mean, fax integration in the larger scheme of a, $50 or $60 billion merger doesn't seem like that big a deal, but it was sort of a choke point for their overall systems integration. Okay, next slide, please. So the 5 steps to heaven process. We'll talk about each of these steps in detail, but the basic idea is that you begin with inventorying what you have. Then you spend as much time as you need to come up with the fantasy vision of what you want the combined organization to look like. This is sort of like designing your dream house. When you think about imagining or envisioning what you want the final state of the organization, its networks, its data to look like. And then the remaining 4 steps, build out the pilot, production rollout, and sustainment, take you through actually building that dream environment out, moving data into it, and conducting your normal operations. So for me, I like to tell people that they should budget more for the environmental inventory and the desired state planning, more time and more dollars than for any other phase. Because if you get those right, the other phases are much more likely to go smoothly. If you skimp on them, however, you are much more likely to run into trouble because, for example, during the build out, you'll build something that is not appropriate for the environment that you are trying to create. Now, Mike, I think you're going to start by taking us through talking about inventory now, right?
Yeah, and so a lot of, Paul, what you're talking about is preparation, and really what I want to talk about in this slide is how we do inventory and help with inventory. And first thing to talk about is really there's 2 kinds of inventories to talk about here. You have application inventory and mapping, and then you have data inventory and mapping. A lot of what we talk about here in the Office 365 space is really kind of the data inventory and mapping. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and what a lot of our organizations that we work with struggle with is doing this inventory correctly, and it really needs to be accurate. So when we look at the basics like CRM systems and databases, Paul used an example of fax, which from my industry experience is the #1 underestimated application out there of people completely underestimating the effort to not only do that migration, but its impact to the organization. But when we look at CRM systems and databases, you may find things out there that would be surprising, very, very difficult to integrate. These database integrations, the mapping the fields to the other fields in the other system, it's a very time-consuming process, and it has to be done very quickly and carefully, which often doesn't go together. We talked about our collaboration tools. When Paul was talking about doing license reconciliation, this is part of that plan. It really goes into here as well. So even when we're talking about the Microsoft scope of tools and services, there's still things like one organization uses Teams, one uses Groups, one uses Yammer, one uses Slack or another third party. So most of it can be mapped into the Microsoft stack, even these kind of one-offs that are outside of it. And that's a lot of what we do with our tools and technologies today. Custom coded applications. The good news here with custom coded applications is usually these are very well documented. Even small organizations that have custom coded applications, their use and their function is very well documented and known. The downside is a lot of times these custom coded applications have some very specific system requirements that sometimes get omitted from the standard build in the acquiring company when that is brought over. So that's kind of the one gotcha there. One thing that really has held up a lot of organizations are the legal tools. So when we're talking about moving email data and other data over that's on legal hold, we'll help map that hold and determine what's on legal hold and bring those policies over. As we was talked about earlier in the presentation, mapping those legal hold procedures and processes and retention tags and all of those things really take a lot of time and effort, but they need to be mapped over to the acquiring company's infrastructure and ensure that it matches. When we talk about just case management, though, usually these organizations are on different systems and you're moving the data at the same time. So when we talk about the legal hold process, we usually hold and retain this data in place and don't want to have any challenges. When we bring it over, we suddenly have to redo these holds and ensure that we got all that data and item counts map and match and things like that. So the legal process can be very challenging when we talk about anything in this application mapping and data mapping. And the one-off I will go over are access databases. That one will bite you almost every time. You're going to find a access database out there that is quote unquote running the world, and you always find these little access databases that people have made that have very critical functions. So I highly recommend doing an inventory of access databases in your environment, identifying them and trying to figure out if there is a critical function there so that you can prevent any potential issues. When we talk about data inventory, a lot of what we have to do is ensure that we're moving these shared repositories and doing it together. We talked about public folders earlier on. Can they go to a shared mailbox? When we talk about just network shares, the example you have on the screen here is, can we combine two finance shares? So usually in a acquisition environment, the two finance departments are coming together. How is that data going to be mushed together? Do we just put it in the existing share and put a subfolder in it? Do we need to operate the two independently? Are the two organizations going to have some functions held at arm's length and others not? So a lot of answers that need to be, or questions that need to be answered here when we're doing this. We talked about legal hold already, and what do we do with lever data? This is always an interesting debate. So a lot of times the acquiring company or the acquired company has a ton of users that are no longer with the organization, but they've got these legacy archives and network shares and home drives and everything else that they had. Should this be mapped over? Should this be brought over? And what is the policy of the acquiring company? We're talking about regions here. A lot of these acquisitions are no longer in the same, let alone country, but in the same continent. We've read about in the last year these very large internet pipes that have been opened up between Europe and North America, which has been great. And really, we've seen in our projects, just seeing these additional pipes and capacities be turned on, we're seeing an increase in these speeds over the pond here for those regions when we're crossing those two. But it's when we were talking about the amount of data that we have, which is drastically larger in the Office 365 space because users have not had limits out there, and they've been on it now for 3, 4, 5, 6, even in some cases back to the BPOS days, more years. There's a lot of data here. And so when we add in this latency and really not the true integration between two cloud environments, it can take some time. So when we're looking at multi-region projects, we also have to keep in mind the data volumes that we're talking about here. We're going to talk about desired state planning in a minute here. And another thing to really go into is sharing. So when we talk about a OneDrive move and a SharePoint move and a group move, some of these items have been shared externally. So that inventory has to be done to see, okay, what was shared and is it being used and should it be reshared on the other side? Some really important things that we're moving into our Cloud Commander product to help address these challenges, to inventory the situation and then either reapply the permissions on the other side or help guide that these permissions should be removed on the other end. So Paul, why don't we talk a little bit about desired state planning a little more?
You bet. Desired state planning, as I mentioned before, you can liken it to the process of imagining what you want your dream house to look like. It's a little more concrete than that because many of us will go through the exercise of imagining a dream house that we'll never build or live in. But the key question to keep in mind as you're going through this state planning process is to think, okay, at all times, I want to focus on what do I want my final environment to look like. This covers every aspect of the environment, starting from what's the tenant name to who's in the tenant, where the tenant's located, and so on. And really, I'll start with tenant location first, because that drives every aspect of functionality and behavior of your Office 365 tenant. Really good example right now. It's from a Quadrotech standpoint. We don't have full access to the new calling features that Microsoft just released in Teams because of where our tenant is located. So although we have operations in 6 or 7 different countries, only about half of them have Teams calling enabled. So we can't get rid of our on-prem Skype infrastructure yet, solely because Microsoft has not turned on the feature we need in the tenant location where our tenant is. What security policies are you going to apply? Who's going to be subject to them? What desktop OS and applications are you going to use? So this is a really interesting topic, because as difficult as it can be to do a tenant-to-tenant combination or migration with Office 365, it can be even worse when you start talking about upgrading desktops. Imagine that you've got 2 organizations. One is running 100% on Windows 7, and the other is running 80% on Windows 10 and 20% on Windows 7. That's going to be a tough problem to solve, especially if the Windows 7 org is buying the other one. Which Office 365 workloads are currently in use? By whom? So imagine that you have 2 organizations where one is using Exchange Online only and has on-prem Skype, on-prem SharePoint, isn't using any of the other features, and they're merging with a company that is 100% in the cloud, heavily uses Skype Online, heavily uses Exchange Online, has been starting to heavily use Teams. Well, now you have a really interesting combination, because you have these 2 systems or 2 cultures where they're using different tools to get their work done. What data will you migrate from where to where? Microsoft likes to talk about how great their migration story is, and it's pretty good for email. It's gotten a lot better from the days when there was no such thing as the Move Server Wizard, and you couldn't move email data at all. But they're only just now getting around to the process of allowing cross-tenant moves in Exchange Online, which is something Quadrotech, as a migration company, has been doing for I don't even know how many years. And they're not addressing at all the other workloads. So if A and B are both using SharePoint, for example, and want to combine their data into a single set of repositories, Microsoft doesn't have any tools. They don't have any tools for migrating Teams data. They have very limited tools for migrating archives of Skype conversations if you're required to archive them. So thinking about what you're going to migrate, where from and where to, is super important. Then the second bookend, if you want to think of it like that, the first bookend should be this question about what you want the final environment to look like. The second bookend question should be, how will you know if the migration was a success, or how will you know if the migration is done? In other words, at what point are you able to measure the state of the new environment and say, yes, this matches the desired state we wanted to get to, or no, it doesn't, and here's what I'm going to do to remediate it. It's easy if you just look at numbers. You can say, well, my migration will be a success when I have 100% of the users in both organizations combined into a single tenant. Okay, well, you can do that in a few minutes with DirSync in a lot of cases, but what about the data they need access to? What about the Office 365 workloads? What about all the other ancillary business problems we talked about around integration with MDM, integration with fax, deciding who's going to be driving the bus? There are a whole bunch of other things that you have to be able to evaluate to know if your migration was successful or not. Okay, next slide, please, Mike. Can't overemphasize this. This is a planning exercise. It's not an exercise. It's not a time in the project when you should be doing a lot, unless you're evaluating technologies or evaluating tools to see if they will do what you want done. The reason why I say that is sometimes people think, oh, desired state planning means I'm going to go out and build a tenant and set up DirSync and do some other stuff in order to help me plan. You have to be very careful about that, because for things like creating a new Office 365 tenant or creating a DirSync relationship, once you do that, it can't easily be undone. And in fact, for the tenant, once you create a tenant and put it in a given location, you can't undo it. So if you think it would be funny to create your tenant and say that its location is Afghanistan, guess what? If you do that, you're going to be stuck with whatever services Microsoft happens to offer. It's customers there. Really important to keep in mind also that this is as much a project management process as it is a technical process. And so you will need access to a strong PM team that understands scheduling and dependencies and resource allocation to help you come up with a credible plan to make this migration happen. I also want to leave with you the notion that this plan, no matter how much time you put into it, is going to have to be revised because conditions will change. Microsoft may add a feature that wasn't available in your region when you started, partway through your migration. They may make other changes to the services that are available, or there may be business changes that you don't have any control over or foreknowledge of. So what I typically tell people is that you do the desired state planning, and then in the pilot, you build in a period of time where you can go back and adjust elements of the plan that might need to be adjusted to make sure that you've accounted for what things may have changed in the interim. Okay, Mike, next slide, please. I mentioned this before, but I want to touch on it again. Where you put your tenant really matters. And this is a big concern for companies that are putting A and B both into a new tenant, C, but also for more conventional combinations when A is moving to B or vice versa. Not every feature is available everywhere, and there are some invisible, I shouldn't say invisible features. There are some other consequences that come along with choosing a tenant location, such as you are taking on a set of data sovereignty and retention and customer privacy rules that are tied to where your tenant is located, in addition to whichever ones you're subject to where your business is located. So imagine, for example, a US company that buys a German company. The German company is subject to German data protection law and subject to EU data protection law, which is about to get much more stringent under GDPR in May of next year. Sadly, in the US, we don't have anything even close to equivalent to those. Germany also has some national data privacy laws. So all of a sudden now you have 3 new sets of laws that the US company has to be aware of and be capable of working with, in addition to all the other complexities we've talked about, such as the fact that some feature the US team uses all the time may not be available in Germany. Seek professional help. Best advice I can give you. If your merger and acquisition scenario crosses multiple national boundaries, you will already be doing that, right? There ought to be a legal team, for example, that's expert in knowing which business regulations and financial compliance regulations apply in each place. Get somebody trusted to help you figure out the IT implications of your merger as well. One case study that I like to talk about is that of a US heavy manufacturing firm that makes locomotives. Their primary US operation is in Alabama, but they've got sizable operations in Brazil and Germany. And just a combination of those 3 countries stalled their Office 365 deployment for close to 2 years because it took them that long to work out what they were going to do about privacy and sovereignty across those 3 locations, because the laws in each of them are so different. Labor law is different, retention requirements are different, financial compliance requirements are different. And it was just a very complicated problem. It took them a long time to work out the solution. Mike, next slide, please.
So this is where I think we're going to talk about build out and pilot and a few of these things. As we talk about tenant location, there's a lot of things that go into how fast you can go, and that's really kind of the common question that everyone asks is how fast can I do this integration and this migration? And I think what's very entertaining is, although the timing and the location of the tenant is extremely important, we're finding one of the most limiting factors is actually the end user impact, and more importantly, the help desk impact for your organization, as we're IT professionals here, being able to keep up with those needs. When we start looking at those 2 things combined, that's really where the limits are. We've gotten some projects where we're able to move very, very quickly, but the help desk cannot keep up with the calls and everything that happens. When we talk about bandwidth and latency considerations, we a lot of times focus only on moving the data from one to the other, but what we also have to keep in mind is a lot of these data locations are cached down to the end user. So we're going to talk about in a minute on how do you move. Do you move by office or do you move by department? And that's always a good debate here. Part of that is, can your users re-download their cache data fast enough, and what is the impact? Do you have quality of service or QoS implemented? That is a really important problem for organizations, especially in the days where we use voice over IP connections. We don't really use, plain old telephone service anymore. So if suddenly all of our computers start downloading our Outlook cache or our OneDrive cache, we can't make or receive phone calls with our clients, which is a very major problem, particularly for an operations team that's customer facing. So we really need to look at these bandwidth considerations. Latency considerations are really what we're talking about in these multi-region locations. In some cases, we may have proper, width of bandwidth, but the latency is very, very high, and that will result in a very slow migration. So we have things that we can try to do to help that, but that is certainly something that we have to keep in mind as we're doing this. When we're talking about pilots, there's a few recommendations that we have. The first is investigate. We talked earlier during application inventory of how important it is to do proper inventory of applications, and we can sit here and look at inventory reports from products like SCCM and Tivoli and these others that are out there, and those are very important. But there is nothing that matches sitting down with your end users and watching them actually work. I've done very large merger acquisition projects, sitting down with very important roles in the organization and watching how they work. And for example, a call center, send someone out to that call center and have them work with the call center agents and actually watch them take calls, watch them with the tools that they're using. And you're going to find a couple things that probably aren't accounted for in the integration plan. It's extremely important to properly investigate how people are using their technology. So when you're hitting all these other stages, you actually have everything, and you're focusing on issues you can avoid rather than these issues that you could have avoided. Communication planning. This isn't new, this is standard. Proper communication is always a key piece, ensuring that your communications team is properly engaged from day one. Testing out communications, testing out methods to communicate. Are there things that you can do differently? So we a lot of times like to just flood users with email communications. If we're going by office, can we just put something on their desk that guides them to how to do something? Proper feedback sessions, again, this is standard rollout in an organization, ensuring you're getting feedback on how things are going. One thing that isn't, that should be standard, but unfortunately really isn't, is diverse pilot groups. So one problem that we see time and time again in our pilots are organizations choose an entire department and they're all doing the same thing. They sit there and say, well, we did a pilot of 500, all went well, everything's doing great, let's move on. That can be great to show performance of a system and should be part of your pilot testing, but you really need to ensure that you're doing diverse pilot groups to try to ensure that you're getting everything. Otherwise, when you hit your performance stage and you're moving, instead of a couple hundred users, but maybe thousands of users, you're going to stumble one day across something that you didn't account for, and it's going to have a very large impact, and you may even have to move users back. So it's very important that you use diverse pilot groups. We talked about using a group of size, which is good, and sometimes that isn't a diverse group, but it is very important that you try to learn the limits of your system as you're doing this migration so that you can do proper planning. And my favorite, document all automation opportunities. We in our products put in script engines so you can kind of shim scripts into doing whatever you need them to do. It's very important that as you find them in pilot, that you document them and try to automate everything as much as you can. Because manual tasks will get forgotten, they won't get done, and they also put a lot of stress on your staff. So if somebody has to log in at 5 in the morning and run a script on Monday morning after the migration weekend, or every morning at 5 a.m. because you're migrating 6 days a week or 5 days a week, whatever you choose, eventually that's going to break down and have user impact. So it's very important that you try to automate and put that into the product as much as you can. My favorite question, Paul, I think you have this debate all the time, and we have it on a project by project basis all the time, is when you're doing rollout, how do you migrate? Do you migrate by office or do you migrate by department? And unfortunately, the answer is always going to be, it depends on your environment and it depends on your users. But here are the things to kind of help guide you when you're making this decision. Obviously, when you can do office by office, it's great because you can kind of send your SEAL team in and have them there and really help reduce calls on your help desk. It's certainly an investment to fly your team in, but it really does allow you to, help ensure that when they leave on Wednesday after the migration, everyone moved over. So when you're doing smaller offices, this can certainly be an advantage. The downside is bandwidth risk, as we talked about earlier. So suddenly when we start moving users over, you have a lot of users downloading a lot of data very quickly. There are a lot of firms, it's surprising that a lot of firms don't know this is available to them, but there are dynamic bandwidth plans. In a lot of cases, you have the equipment already going to your site that can support far higher bandwidth speeds. You are able, and a lot of times, do dynamic bandwidth, bump yourself up for a week, and then put you back down to your normal run. So those are things that you should look into if you have those options. If you're going by office or by department, when we buy cross-tenant issues, it's the issue of collaborating across multiple tenants. In the world of the hybrid organization and dotted lines and everything else in the org chart, this has become less and less of a debate, but certainly is important. When you go by department, there is less impact. In a lot of organizations, the department and the physical location are two very different things. So when you can move by department, it really allows the work groups to continue to collaborate better together and move forward, but you can sometimes lose some of the advantages of having that day one support. Training and communications, when you're again on site, your SEAL team can do their training, so they can come in on a Thursday, do their training and kind of keep things running. By department, you have to combat it with remote, which has some challenges sometimes with attendance, and sometimes people aren't as engaged. So Paul, I think we're going to quickly go to sustainment. We just got a few minutes, and we're going to talk quickly about radar, and then we'll try to wrap up the hour.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Sustainment's easy to talk about because it's just doing what you already do, right? Everybody on this webinar, everybody in the industry is already used to running an existing environment and keeping it going for users and fixing problems as they arise. The one thing to keep in mind is that because the base of users that you're supporting has changed and the underlying infrastructure has probably changed too, that may mean that there are changes in your support structure. So for example, going back to the integration stuff we were talking about earlier, if company A is using Parature for service desk management and company B is using ServiceNow, for example, well, you need to figure out some way to mash those two together. And then on top of that, just from a personnel standpoint, you may find that you have some inequities that you need to address in terms of where your support people are and what they know to make sure that everybody is adequately trained to handle the load of the merged organization. But keep in mind that sustainment, in some ways is the easiest of all these phases because it's just continuing to do what you've already been doing. Although the environment may have changed a little bit, none of the basic skills and knowledge that you have are obsoleted by these changes. And it's not like having, Mike, you know this well. When you go in to talk to a customer about doing a migration, sometimes they have to learn a completely new vocabulary. There are a whole bunch of new concepts to assimilate. They have the cognitive load of trying to learn new products. I mean, that's part of the reason why our managed migration services are so popular, because customers don't want to have to learn this stuff for a one-time deal. But in the sustainment world, whatever you're learning that's new, you can continue to reuse.
And one thing to note here as we wrap up is one of the real powers that we have in our tool set outside of our migration technology is our radar reporting product. And we're actually launching as we move towards integrating all of our products into our reporting suite and really letting our data drive it. We are launching a series of reports to help drive your migration. One of the things, so these are just three that we're starting with, and you're going to see this quickly expand, but helping do a lot of things that we're talking here. So as an example, when I'm helping today an organization plan their integration or their migration, we can very quickly power up radar, and within a day I have enough data to really guide an organization how to do their integration project, looking at data volumes and use and workloads and licensing, and all these pieces are in there, and using the data correctly. A lot of it is kind of some of the magic sauce that we're doing here at Quadrotech as part of the consulting services, but we're really trying to move more and more to that into the standard offering inside Radar. We do offer quite a few trials of Radar on our website, so certainly if you're interested, take a look, and you can activate your free trial to see what that product has to offer. So with that, unfortunately, we're right at the end of the hour. We will, any questions that you have, though, we will follow up with you personally on any that you have. Paul, before we end here, is there anything you want to add?
No, just that I want to thank everybody for attending, and look for an announcement coming very soon about when we will do part 2, covering these same topics from the other end of the telescope, focusing on divestiture.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul, for joining us today, and we will be in touch with the date on the next webinar series. Thank you very much.